I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com.
Hi, Brian. My name's Paul O'Connell. I'm a reporter with Sunday World.
Yeah, well, I don't speak to reporters. Sorry about that.
I want to say sorry to Veronica.
No, I don't want to speak to you. Thanks.
Are you saying no, you wouldn't want to say sorry?
I'm not the type to speak to journalists. I'm not coming to me.
Well, can I ask you one other thing? Are you still in contact with Peter Mitchell?
Fuck off.
Excuse me? There's no need for that. Are you still in contact with Peter Mitchell, Brian? No.
So that's a video of you confronting Brian Meehan, who probably wasn't delighted to see you, Pat. You know, how dare he? But of course, Brian Meehan, there is a reason why Brian Meehan is one of the most notorious criminals and why that question is posed to him. And Brian Meehan is now out and about on the streets of Dublin, but he is one of the longer serving prisoners in Ireland because he still remains in custody. And it's in connection with a crime that I'd say there's not a single person in the country, even though it was so long ago, doesn't know the details of.
Yeah.
Tell us about what Brian Meehan's role in that murder was.
Yeah, well, I suppose the reason we're talking about Brian Meehan at the moment is he's coming up to the end of his sentence for the murder of Veronica Guerin. He spent 27 years behind bars. He spent much of that in Portlaoise, but a few years ago he got moved to Shelton Abbey open prison, and now he's been released, getting regular daily TRs. He's coming up to Dublin to attend college courses, and that's the reason why he's been appearing more in the media. As you say, he was centrally involved in the murder of Veronica Guerin.
Because of course that murder was carried out by what's called the Gilligan gang, really. Yeah. John Gilligan, who headed up that crime organisation, who in the early 90s became by far and away the biggest drugs gang that this country had ever seen. Mm-hmm. Now, Brian Meehan was not a runner or a gopher in that gang. He was probably, in the number 2 or number 3, whatever way you want to look at it, like a very, very serious criminal in of its own right. But obviously, Veronica Guerin really targeted them.
She did.
Some people will remember will have seen the film, but other people might remember the stories where really Gilligan became this multi-millionaire. He bought, it's sort of inconceivable now that he bought this equestrian centre, lived openly. And of course it was all from the proceeds of drugs. Veronica Guerin confronted him, and Gilligan, being a bully, couldn't take it. And obviously then his gang targeted her. Mm-hmm. Now, Brian Meehan is the only man convicted of Veronica Guerin's murder.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're talking about Brian Meehan, it's worth looking at his background as well, because this is a crime that happened, almost 30 years ago now. So a lot of the younger viewers of this podcast, they wouldn't be familiar with the background that you've just gone through.
Yeah.
So Brian Meehan would have been somebody who was involved in crime for a very early age. I think he had 15 convictions when 1989 he recorded his first major conviction, and that conviction is kind of crucial to all of this, because he received a 6-year jail sentence for a robbery of an AIB on Grafton Street, and then he was sent to Portlaoise prison. And around about that time, John Gilligan was also serving a sentence. Gilligan would have been known as Factory John because he carried out robberies of warehouses around the M50. So Gilligan had received a 4-year sentence for that. So Meehan and Gilligan were in Portlaoise at the same time.
And they were probably
friends.
Yeah, and that's probably at the end of that armed robbery wave that they were, because Meehan was a lot younger, a good bit younger anyway.
He would have been,
Yeah, but he was kind of on the edges of the the General Cahill's gang, maybe doing...
Yeah, he would have grown up in Crumlin, and he would have been known as somebody who was involved in it.
Yeah, and he would have been a decade younger than them or more, and he was kind of doing little bits for them. But similarly, Gilligan would have been on the edges of that. But then they both went to prison, and they both came out and got involved in this new wave of the drugs trade, really.
Yeah, it was far more lucrative than carrying out robberies. And to their mind at that stage, it was probably less risky as well. So when Gilligan and Meehan, Gilligan got out in 1993, Mian followed him in 1994. They immediately teamed up. They found a connect over in Amsterdam who was willing to ship large quantities of cannabis back to Ireland. Now, obviously, they were both just out of prison. They may have had their own resources, but they also sought additional financing. And one of the people they're reputed to have sought financing for was Martin Cahill, the general, who was himself murdered in 1994.
Yeah, and that's one of the great conspiracies of Irish gangland. Did they got money off him, and did Gilligan then double cross him with the IRA? And we can never answer that. But all we know is that they got that money and they hit the drugs hit the street at the right time when there was
they moved
market.
Pretty soon they were importing drugs on a massive scale. The drugs were being packaged over in Amsterdam. They were being put in these boxes labeled spare parts, and then they were being shipped to Ireland to a where they were being stored in a warehouse. And then the Gilligan gang set up this wholesale distribution network, and it was massive. I mean, within the space of 2 years, Gardaí estimated that they had brought in between 17 and 20 million euros worth of cannabis into this country. So they were huge, and that's the reason why Veronica Guerin, in her work, became aware of Gilligan, and that's what brought her to his door in Jessbrook. And when she did confront him that day in Jessbrook, Gilligan was an extremely rough. He was an antagonistic character. He's very, very an unpleasant individual.
Yeah, and remains as such, I think.
Absolutely. Any journalist who's ever spoken with John Gilligan will tell you he is an unpleasant character. Yeah. He assaulted Veronica Guerin in Jessbrook that day and chased her off the property. And then the following day, he basically made a follow-up phone call to Veronica Guerin, threatening her that if she published anything, that, they're very serious threats. And these were overheard by Veronica's barrister, Felix McEnroe. And the two of them went to the Garda station and they made a complaint against Gilligan. And it was that complaint and Gilligan's fears that this would result in them going back to prison that Gardaí believe prompted Gilligan to order Veronica Guerin's murder.
So in 1996, Veronica Guerin is attending, I think she had a traffic matter in a district court.
That's right.
And it's believed that the Gilligan, probably through John Traynor, but again, never proven in a court of law, but it's believed that they got a tip off. And as she was coming out.
Yeah, she was driving. So she had attended the court. It was a speeding fine, and she was making her way back up to Dublin. She was on the Nice Road when a motorcycle pulled up next to her. A gunman who we now know was Patrick Dutchy Howland. He used the butt of the gun to break the window, and he opened fire on Veronica Guerin, killing her.
Yeah. Now, he was obviously the pillion passenger, as they call it, but there was a man driving the motorbike. And that ultimately was proven in court to be Brian Meehan.
Yeah.
And he was convicted in large part because of, the testimony of a guy called Charles Bowden.
Yeah, Charles Bowden and Russell Warren. I think in fact it was Russell Warren's evidence that did more damage to Brian Meehan because the court found him to be a more trustworthy witness than Charles Bowden.
Because Charles Bowden, of course, was a former army man who'd become a key member of the Gilligan drugs gang, and he very dramatically became Supergrass. Now, obviously, the murder of Veronica Guerin was, it was one of those moments that really genuinely, it's a cliche to say it shocked the nation, but it genuinely did, and it sparked this outpouring of grief because she'd been a very public figure, but a very sort of courageous public figure, but also because it sparked this kind of horror that drug gangs were willing to do this in this country.
And there was a context because this happened like a month after the murder of Jerry McKay by the IRA. So there was already a huge amount of revulsion in this country over violence of that nature. But then to have Veronica's murder follow so quickly, that was obviously, it seemed like the state itself was under pressure, that it was under attack. And I think at that time, there was a new Garda commissioner in place, Pat Byrne. And Pat Byrne very quickly set up a crack team of detectives to take down the Gilligan gang and to find those and identify and arrest those who were responsible for Veronica's murder. Now, obviously, the gang had made a mistake. They thought that this would go down as just another killing, that maybe in a couple of weeks people would forget about it. But that wasn't the case in this instance. I mean, Veronica Guerin was somebody that people in houses around the country, they knew her, they trusted her, they liked her. She was a high profile crime journalist. She was, on the same level as the likes of Paul Williams at the time. Very, very well known.
Yeah, and she was a mother and all of these things, and, a very direct person, I think, that people felt had integrity.
Absolutely. And she was somebody who was putting herself out there in a field that people accepted was dangerous, but I don't think anybody ever believed that a gang would turn around and kill her for the work she was doing.
So they all fled really straight after, as this national outcry began. Brian Meehan ultimately would be arrested in Amsterdam, I think.
Yeah, well, Meehan and Traynor, they fled to Amsterdam, but I mean, as I said, Pat Byrne had put in place this team led by Tony Hickey, a former assistant commissioner, and basically they began hoovering up members of the gang. And two of the big breaks in the investigation, I suppose, came with the arrests of Charles Bowden and Russell Warren. Now, Bowden, as you say, he was an ex-Irish Army soldier. He had he had served in the Lebanon, but he had been dishonorably discharged from the army for beating up new recruits, two of whom ended up being hospitalized. So after he was discharged from the army, he began working as a doorman. And from that, he graduated into dealing ecstasy at the doors, and then all the way up to becoming a fairly pivotal member of the Gilligan gang. He was basically the wholesale distributor. So when the drugs arrived in Ireland, he was the guy who was in charge of making sure they got distributed to the right people, and keeping the Irish end of the operation going. So he's a very senior member of the gang. And
also he had that expertise in weaponry as well, which was very important, because a lot of these criminal gangs don't have somebody like that.
No, he served as the quartermaster or armourer, because he was familiar with the weapons. But he flipped very quickly. Once the Gardaí arrested him, they made a deal with him. In exchange for immunity from prosecution for Veronica's murder, he gave up everything. He identified the whereabouts of weapons caches. They were using a grave in the Jewish graveyard in Tala. He gave up the location of the warehouse where the guards found close enough to 1,000 kilograms of cannabis. And he agreed to give evidence against Brian Meehan, against John Gilligan, against Dutchy Holland. So that was significant. And then there was Russell Warren. Russell Warren had stolen the motorbike that was used in the murder, the Kawasaki. And Russell Warren, again, agreed to give evidence. And the nature of his evidence was that Brian Meehan, that he had stolen the bike. Brian Meehan had inspected the bike. Brian Meehan had ordered certain repairs to be done on the bike, that he had taken it for a test drive, and that he had collected it on the morning of the murder. And not only that, he had tasked Russell Warren to basically carry out surveillance on Veronica Guerin's car after she left the courthouse, and to stay in contact with him by phone on the morning of the murder, updating him on the whereabouts of Veronica's car. And that was crucial because there was also phone evidence then that the court was able to rely on that showed these phone calls going between Brian Meehan and Russell Warren on the morning of the murder. So there was independent verification for Russell Warren's testimony. Now, when it came to Charlie Bowden, the court was far more skeptical. They identified Bowden as somebody who would have been willing to lie on the stand. There was various discrepancies found in his evidence, but the court accepted his evidence insofar as it went to the drug dealing and the weapons. Those were also charges for which Mian was before the court. But they said when it came to the murder, the court didn't accept his evidence on that. They relied on Russell Warren's.
Yeah,
so it was on the basis of that Mian would ultimately be convicted.
Exactly. They could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt with those other circumstances. Now, Bowden did give very dramatic evidence about Mian contacting him the next day and saying it was a good job and all of that. But
yeah, I think he said he had met Meehan, and that Meehan had basically told him that he was riding on the bike. He said, it's a good job. And he said, I thought he was only going to shoot her a couple of times. but he emptied the whole gun into her. Fair play. And that was a chilling moment. And then
it was. And of course then, so Brian Meehan, automatically, he's found guilty. He gets a life sentence, which, as many people know, but just to explain it anyway, it means that you're serving that sentence for the rest of your life, but it doesn't have a particular term.
No.
In Ireland, look, the numbers go up and down, and life sentences are getting a bit longer, but something around 21, 19 to 21 years for a conviction. And he also, I suppose, received very lengthy sentences for the drug offences, and in the court he's described as being not, almost to the top of that drugs gang. So he goes into prison. How does he get on in prison, I suppose, Brian Meehan?
Well, he spent a large part of the 27 years that he spent behind bars. He spent it in Portlaoise, which would be a tough place.
Yeah.
It's a tough prison, but he was somebody who had, serious connections, so he would have been treated with a degree of respect. And then a few years ago, he got moved to Shelton Abbey. And I think there was a certain amount of controversy a couple of years ago when it emerged that the Irish Prison Service was spending €600,000 on each of these 10 independent living units that they were.
Describe what they are like. They're kind of pods, really. Are they kind of?
Well, they're pods. But they're basically set up to. They're set up so the person living in them can almost feel like they're not living in prison. It's almost like a halfway between being in prison and being released. There's very little oversight, so you get to live independently in this unit on the grounds. And at the same time, they also have him doing these courses, so he can update himself with modern technology. Most recently he's been attending a course, dealing with smartphones, and how to use them.
Yeah. So obviously in 27 years, the world changes, and that people no doubt become institutionalized. No matter what your crime is, that length of time behind bars, particularly in Portlaoise, which is a very locked down kind of, I think it's by far the most high security prison we have. Mm. So, people, institutionalization is a real thing.
And also you have to look at that former associates of Meehan's, the likes of John Gilligan, they're no longer around. I mean, John Traynor is dead.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, that's something else that changes. Alliances change. And we saw that in particular with John Gilligan, who I don't think anybody, no matter on what side of crime you fall on. Nobody would have ever described John Gilligan as a particularly loyal character. And in terms of Meehan, in 2023, John Gilligan gave an interview in this documentary by Jason O'Toole, the Gilligan tapes, where he was asked about Veronica Guerin's murder. And Gilligan said during this interview that 1,000,000% Brian Meehan was the man who was riding the bike that day. Now Meehan, or Gilligan, as always, was self-serving. Gilligan said that he wasn't the one who ordered the murder, that Meehan had confessed to him in prison, that it was John Traynor who had actually ordered the murder, and that Meehan drove the bike, and that it was actually the state witness, Charlie Bowden, who had pulled the trigger. Now, during the trial, Bowden was asked about this. He was asked about this claim that it was him, with this background in marksmanship, that it was him who had pulled the trigger, and that was denied. And ultimately, the court satisfied itself that it was, in fact, Patrick Dutchy Holland.
Yeah, though, of course, Dutchy Holland continued to deny it and was never...
He was never
charged, convicted.
But he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for drug dealing on the evidence of Charlie Bowden.
He was, and he was also linked to a number of other murders. Let's be realistic about Dutchy Holland. I mean, he was linked to a number of high-profile assassinations. However, Meehan, when he got into prison, Meehan and Gilligan had a big falling out. I think, and certainly what I was told about Meehan was for the first number of years during his sentence, he still had connections outside. For example, Peter Fatso Mitchell, who ultimately now is serving, just finished serving a sentence in the UK for cocaine trafficking, and was very close to Meehan and also a senior member of that gang. And that initially Meehan still had sort of links and involvement in the drugs trade, but that in recent times, he's a forgotten man. Whether he's chosen to be forgotten and moved on, or the world has just moved on and doesn't care about him anymore, that he has certainly engaged with rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what sort of life would he have in Shelton Abbey? I mean, you've obviously been there as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a Downton Abbey from the outside, is it? But I presume it's not like Downton Abbey in
No, it's look. I mean, it's an open prison.
Yeah.
And the prisoners who are there, they're there on trust.
Yeah.
There's certain things that are permitted in the prison, and there's certain things that aren't permitted in the prison. Prisoners aren't allowed to. They're not allowed to drink. If they're found to have drink on them, they'll be put back into the main prison system. There's structures. There's different activities there. Like one of the things Meehan did while he was in Shelton Abbey was he convinced authorities to basically put in this putting green so the prisoners can can play golf.
Yeah.
In those things, I suppose from the outside looking in, you're looking at somebody who was responsible for Veronica Guerin's murder, and now they're in an open prison practicing golf and everything, and you're looking at it and going, what's wrong with the country?
Yeah.
But I suppose the flip side of it is that once somebody has spent 27 years in custody, that's above average for a life sentence in this country. It's about basically trying to ensure that they don't commit new crimes when they get out of prison.
Yeah.
So it's an effort by the state to rehabilitate these people so they can be reintegrated into society once they get out.
Which is part of the government policy and our criminal justice policy. I mean, we have that's a stated goal, which is rehabilitation, and reform. We don't have a policy of locking people up just to as punishment. That's
no, it's not like
that's not the philosophy that we have.
No, it's not like in America where if somebody commits if this crime had been committed in America, it's quite likely the people who are responsible for it would have spent the rest of their lives in prison
without parole.
Without parole, we don't have that system here. We have a system where people are given life sentences, and those are there is no defined limit to the life sentence. So even when Brian Meehan is given full licensed release, if he offends again, he can be sent back to prison under the life sentence.
Yeah.
It's a licensed release. It's not a full release.
No, and I mean he can be taken back in even without a particular offence being proven, I think. However, so that's our system. But of course, the family of Veronica Guerin, may feel totally different. I mean, they are also entitled to say that they don't want him to be released, that they don't think he should be, and the people who love Veronica and knew her may feel the same. And of course, Veronica Guerin's brother has spoken in the past about Brian Meehan and his thoughts on his rehabilitation, I suppose.
Yeah, he has, but I think in more recent times, Jimmy has taken a step back from publicly speaking about this. Yeah.
So Brian Meehan now, he's out. Obviously, you confronted him there in Dublin City Centre. He's with a couple of people, but they're not prison officers or anything like that. They're just, associates or whatever, friends. So he's unaccompanied.
Yeah.
And what would be his terms now? I mean, as far as we know, is that he would be allowed out for time but told to come back in for the evenings?
These are daily temporary releases. Yeah. So you'd be given a time that you can leave the prison in the morning and a time that you have to be back in the evening. And then there would be weekend tours. And these basically build up over time until you achieve, a full licensed release. And the stage that Meehan's at would seem to suggest that that's going to happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, because they don't keep it like that forever. But
no,
obviously, then it's a trust system, is it? If he doesn't come back on time or whatever, all of these things are taken into account.
Yeah, they can impact on the full release day.
So, I mean, when you're looking at a life sentence prisoner like that, when they start coming out day by day, and then maybe it's another few months or a year, is it? And then they're totally out. Do they have to interact then with the prison system as a life sentence prisoner? Did you have to do sort of monthly checkups?
They'd move in, then it would be the probation service that would deal with them.
Yeah.
But I suppose the key question that people want to know when somebody like Brian Meehan is coming out of prison is whether he's sorry, whether whether he's rehabilitated, whether he's a reformed character. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to speak with Brian Meehan to ask him, does he accept now that his role in the murder of Veronica Guerin, and is he sorry for it? But as you saw in the video, he didn't want to talk to us.
Now, of course, he may have spoken to a parole board or whatever, and that's always going to be private, so we'll never know. But certainly, publicly, he's not chatty, is he?
No,
he's not chatty. Well, look, we'll continue to follow this story and see if he ever does change his mind and wants to ring you up and have a chat. But it seems unlikely, doesn't it, Pat?
It does.
Okay, thanks, Pat, for coming in.